In this video, you are going to learn practical tips for how you can better pastor your team and congregation as a worship leader. Today, I'm joined by Zac Hicks. He is a worship pastor here in Birmingham, Alabama. He's also a husband, a dad, and he's also an author. He wrote the book, The Worship Pastor. So today I wanted to answer some of the questions that folks have about how to better pastor their congregations in worship. So we had some of the students from Worship Leader School send in some questions, and I got them right here, and we're just going to work our way through these questions. These are really, really great questions, and I think you watching this video, you'll probably find a lot of the practical tips that we're about to talk about and Zach's about to share very helpful for you as a worship leader. So the first question I have for you, Zach, is this one. This is from Cameron, and Cameron asks, what are some practical tips for pastoring a worship team on a weekly basis? What have you found effective, whether that's devotionals, prayer requests, texting, or sending articles, etc.? So a great question. How do we actually pastor our teams?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two dimensions to pastoring our teams. I think we need to think about it as a group pastoring dynamic and then an individual pastoring dynamic. So when we gather together, preparing in and around worship services, it's a great time to inject little moments that are devotional, that kind of center our hearts around the biblical and pastoral realities of what we're doing. And even praying together is a good time to center everybody. I think it's good before worship services to carve out time so that you're not just rehearsing, but you actually you've got some downtime to hang out and to pray together and aim your prayers in a missional direction rather than a personal one. But that's kind of in tandem, and I don't think it's good enough to just do that, or it won't go deep enough. And really for me, I'm trying to pursue them individually, one-on-one, maybe get together with one of them at least every other month or so to hang out for coffee, to hear how they're doing, to dive more deeply into how their faith is going and what issues they have in their lives. And then in the midst of those two things, I like to do check-ins. So I'll send just texts letting them know I'm praying for them, send them a psalm or something. Or if I know that they're kind of in the middle of something difficult or acute, I like to just try to spend a little more time connecting and touching them one-on-one.
The next question comes from Chad. He asks, how do you shepherd a multi-generational community when you know there are major differences in their means of worship stylistically?
Yeah, I think this ultimately comes down to an issue of discipleship. It's really a gospel issue about when everybody's believing the gospel, when everybody's a disciple, it means that everybody's dying a little bit to their own preferences. So if you're in a church that has a multi-generational, multicultural context, if it's thriving, it's because everybody understands that part of what I bring to this community is giving something up. Part of what I do is actually serve my brother or sister before myself. And how do you cultivate that with your people? How do you actually live into that? I think that's a long-term thing. And it's kind of like what I was talking before. I think it's a combination of group teaching, where you're actually able to talk about what I just said and say, this is what the mature life of discipleship looks like, is actually laying down our swords. But it's also getting together with individuals. I mean, over the course of my ministry, I've gotten together and had coffee with lots of people who've had difficulty with other people or difficulty with some things we're doing in worship because it's sort of not their bag. And building those relationships and even hearing their stories without necessarily arguing or providing answers goes a long way.
The next question comes from Trevor. He asks, how do you help others see worship as more than just music and singing on Sunday, but every aspect of our lives?
Yeah, a lot of that can be helped by the way that you pray, particularly as you enter into a worship service and as you leave a worship service. I think that those are two great times to tether what's about to transpire on a Sunday with the whole life worship that happens in and around that hour and a half. So a lot of times for me, when I'm entering into a worship service, the way I like to pray or lead people in thinking is that instead of talking about beginning worship, God, as we've been worshiping you, now we ask that you would be with us as we've gathered to faithfully worship you. And at the end of the service, you say, Lord, send us out to live lives of worship on mission, so that as we go about our jobs and as we tell others about your name, we are doing so in honor and glory of you. I think those are two real keys. And apart from that, maybe it's time that you as a worship leader should teach on the subject, or maybe that's always on the front of your mind when you're hanging out with people one-on-one and you're having conversations about it, is to allow that to be your talking point, to maybe even phrase your question when you're asking someone how their faith is in Jesus, asking what is it like being a worshiper outside the walls of our church?
Next question comes from Joshua. He asked, how do I engage the congregation more in worship? My desire is that they leave wanting to spend more time alone with God. And he also wants them to be freed to worship through lifting hands and not being worried about what their neighbor thinks of them. So a couple kind of questions in there. But
yeah, I think maybe a meta point is, if we're trying to lead our people toward growth in a certain area, we need to lead in incremental steps. So say we're wanting our congregation to grow in physical expression. I've heard it well said that if you're a leader and you're leading too far out, you actually get perceived as the enemy. It's kind of like you're on a battlefield and you're far out in front of your people. And if you're too far out, people are like, is he with us, or is she with us, or is she against us? And I think that holds true for something like, you want your vocalists or people up front, or your choir or whoever, to be a little bit further out than your people and anywhere you want them to grow, especially when you're talking about physical expression. But you don't want them to be wild and crazy if your people aren't wild and crazy, because they'll perceive them as the enemy. They'll be like, who are those crazies? Instead, you want to say, if we're trying to get from A to Z, what's B, C, and D, and how can we do that for a few months and then grow in that over time?
The next question comes from Audra. She asked, how do you pastor people that are doing churchianity and have healthy relationships with them? So maybe unpack what you think churchianity means. I think I get what she means here, but...
Yeah, I think what churchianity means is just kind of going through the motions of cultural Christianity, or checking the box of church attendance without any real major impact or any relationship with the Lord being identified. I think that ultimately you could browbeat them. You can kind of be prophetic and say negative things, or kind of speak words of condemnation on churchianity, which would be a biblical thing to do. I mean, there's plenty of words of condemnation. But the more winsome way is to actually put forth what might be exciting and compelling about something beyond that, and modeling that. So I found that the way I've gotten out of ruts in my own faith is by being surrounded by people whose love for Jesus and passion for him are authentic and contagious. They're not contrived. And so maybe it is that you pursue those people and make sure to talk a lot about what your relationship with God means to you, what your relationship with God is like, and how a life of worship outside affects the way that you behave Monday through Saturday, and kind of testifying. It's one of those things where you share a testimony. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Sometimes churchianity is actually a smokescreen or a cloak for faithlessness. Sometimes people are coming to church and they aren't really Christians. And though it's not our job to figure out who's who, it's an opportunity to say, gosh, I need to preach the gospel. I need to tell them about who Jesus is and what he's done. And there's certainly something contagious about sharing that in light about how that's affected you. So it's kind of evangelism 101 in many ways.
Sam asks, how do you get the congregation to see you as a pastoral role, not just the one they complain to about music?
Yeah, that's funny. I think it first starts with you. It's kind of owning that what you do is pastoral, and then behaving in pastoral ways. So as you plan and lead worship services, you're increasingly aware. I mean, take the master class, read my book, and then I'll get you a little bit more into how you can reframe what you do. Because I do think that as we behave and lead and teach and do what we do on Sunday mornings in more pastoral ways, our congregations will begin to perceive and receive that pastoral ministry. I do think, too, that there's a lot that can happen in between the worship services, in the moments during the week, which may involve more people time. Especially if you got those people that are complaining to you. Maybe they should be the ones that you're hanging out with, that you're actually pursuing. I often find this axiom to be true, that keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So that's actually spend time with the haters, with the people. And instead of just sort of dialoguing about the issues that they want to, they may need to get that off their chest. But I find that often just hearing them out, who are you? Tell me about your history. Tell me about your walk with the Lord. Tell me what's going on in your life. Those kinds of things, one-on-one, begin to have pastoral ripple effects in your entire congregation. And even if your congregation is too large for you to do that with everybody, if you're doing that with a good cross-section of people, that perception of you up there changes.
Well, that's all the questions that we have time for today. If you're a worship leader school student and you sent in a question, thanks so much. And as you guys can tell, Zac has so much great insight that's going to help us all as worship leaders. And he literally wrote the book on being a better worship pastor. It's called The Worship Pastor. So pick up a copy of this book. I'm going to link it below this video. And we also just wrapped up filming an entire masterclass for worship leader school on this topic. And as we were filming this class, we really just wrapped up doing it a few minutes ago before making this video, but as we were filming this class today, there's a lot of things about this topic that I was familiar with, but just hearing you unpack these things again during this masterclass, it's just like some of these things I'm like, wow, I just really think about it that way, or it just really helped shed a lot of light on, personally, for myself and my own ministry. So thanks so much for your contribution to Worship Leader School. So if you guys want to check out Worship Leader School in the masterclass, we're going to put a link to that below in the description. We've got a ton of other online courses and masterclasses and a community and live coaching available for you as a worship leader. So just go to worshipleaderschool.com to learn more. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, smash that thumbs up button and share it with your friends in ministry. You can check out some related videos right on over here, and don't forget to subscribe to the Churchfront channel so you can continue to receive all of our latest content to help you grow yourself and grow your worship ministry.